The Committee of the Whole on Bill 79-35 COR is now in order. Rules of engagement would have the sponsor, the author of the bill, would give their introduction and explanation of what amendments that were made. I'd like to introduce the panel, and we will start with Mr. Gash from Guam Solid Waste. We have Mr. Byrne from the Department of Administration, the Director. We have the Director of BBMR, Mr. Lester Carlson. We have to my left, we have the Director of GITA, Ms. Mel Mendiola, and we have the Deputy Director, Ricky Hernandez. Questions for the panel. Questions for the panel will be asked in 2 rounds. Once we begin with one senator and we return to that senator, that begins the second round. So my colleagues, please understand that. If we begin with Senator Terlahi, as everybody's given an opportunity to ask questions, and she asks another question, that will begin the second round. The time limit for senators will be 3 minutes. Amendments must be submitted in writing to the clerk and legal counsel before the motion to amend is made on the floor. All amendments will be entertained after the panel has been dismissed. Yes, Senator Lai.
Just to clarify, Mr. Chair, I appreciate the rules, but 3 minutes seems very short. Are you saying we're going to take care of our round 1 questions 3 minutes each?
You have 3 minutes to ask your questions. I mean, I would hope that your question is not more than 3 minutes. You know, the panel's all here.
Well, I understand. We've seen this bond questioning before, and then 3 minutes just seems extremely short. How many rounds are you allowing?
2 rounds.
So that's 6 minutes per senator to talk about $30 million of borrowing. That's less than we would have had in second reading. And Committee of the Whole is intended to get to the answers and to have a more free discussion, not a more restricted discussion. And we're normally allowed 15 minutes.
You're normally allowed 15 minutes, and I think once the author has explained about her bill and everything, most of the questions may be answered. And if we need to make adjustment, then we'll make adjustment as we move. But I prefer we stick with the 3 minutes so that we're all in order and we just move along and not make this be a public hearing like we just had not too long ago. All right?
Well, I just don't want to make a mockery of the Committee of the Whole process either, Mr. Chair. I understand you want it to be strict, but we need to be able to freely get the answers to our questions. You know,
Yes.
It takes sometimes the panel longer than 3 minutes to even answer one question. So I just want to be reasonable. That's all I'm asking. If you're for your consideration to
Yes.
extend those guidelines until we are satisfied that we are
Yes.
representing the people of Guam well in borrowing $30 million at this rate.
All right, no problem. I'll make sure the panel responds a little bit faster. I hope they got their notes. But I understand where you come
Mr.
from.
Speaker, I'm saying we
Yeah.
need their answers. We don't
Yes.
want them to be on a time limit either.
No, they won't have the 3 minute time limit. It's on the senators. It's on the questions that you're asking. Okay? We will now begin with the author of the bill. You please introduce your bill and explain what the amendments were and why they exist, and then we can move from there. Ma'am, Senator Sabina Paris.
Thank you so much. First, I want to thank the Speaker for calling the session to hear this very important measure. I want to thank Chairman Joe San Agustin for chairing the Committee on the Whole. And I would like to also thank my colleagues for expeditiously hearing this important measure today. I would like to also thank the guests that have come here today, whom we've invited. It's through your hard work and expertise that helped craft these favorable financial terms that have been incorporated into the bill. And we appreciate your participation today. So Bill 7935 is an important bill for our people and our island. It finances the expansion of Luzon Landfill at a time when the landfill is due to fill up in 2 years. It also helps end receivership. As we all are well aware of our solid waste receivership issues, I just want to emphasize that Judge Tadinko Gatewood mentioned that This is key to ending receivership. The financing of this third cell is key to ending receivership. And so Bill 7935 does this exactly. What it does, it authorizes GovGuam to borrow or issue one or more of a series of bonds not to exceed $30 million that will go towards financing the third cell at Luzon. So because the market is wary of Guam Solid Waste's receivership, the bonds are backed by GovGuam, yet it will be paid by the revenues that are through the services of Guam Solid Waste Authority, which brings us more favorable borrowing terms. And the interest rates in the bill, it says it's not to exceed 6%, but the current market rates are roughly 4% or less. The maturity date is set at 12 and a half years, so 2 years for the construction, and the remainder being the lifespan of the cell. So the changes to the bill was made in committee by recommendation by the fiscal team. One of the big change was the PUC waiver. And this was actually agreed to by Judge Tedinko Gatewood because the timeline is very stringent. We need to get the financing before the rainy season starts. Actually, we need to start constructing the landfill before the rainy season starts, which means we need to secure the financing even before that time. In fact, we're due in court in July to report back that we did get the funding. So it's very critical to have the funding. If we do not get this funding, then we risk the ire of the court and returning back to full receivership. So this is a very critical bill. And this window of opportunity may not come again in the near future because actually I was able to sit through a lot of the discussions with US EPA, Department of Justice. And no way was it clear that they were going to end receivership. There was a lot of back and forth negotiations. And now that we've come to this agreement, I think this opportunity is within our reach. And it's critical because it proves to the courts, it proves to US EPA, it proves to the Department of Justice, it proves to ourselves that we are ready to regain control over our solid waste operations. We just need to make sure we provide the financing in a sufficient and appropriate time. And so timing is of the essence before we reach the full capacity of our landfill in 2 years. And bear in mind, it takes 2 years to build this landfill. And this is why this PUC waiver is critical, only for this one time. It doesn't mean we can bring in it doesn't mean we're going to, what this means is we don't, we're trying to seek the waiver for PUC at this time, but they can still come in and do the rate case after this. But we just need to overcome this time constraints. So we have two choices here. We can either finance the Luzon landfill with reasonable terms without raising rates as outlined in the bill, or we can reject the bill and pay for the construction through immediate and extreme rate increases. I think, we all have the public interest in mind here. And I think borrowing in reasonable terms is the right choice for our people and to prevent the environmental disaster which can happen in 2 years when our landfill fills up. So I think these, it's a hard decision, and it's kind of symbolic because this is what got us into the consent decree in the first place. Our politicians could not make these hard decisions. And I asked my colleagues for their support, and I thank the co-sponsors who see the need and the importance of funding this landfill, or funding the expansion of this landfill. So I anticipate the productive discussion today with my colleagues and our guests, and I look forward to a timely action on Bill 7935 in order to protect the ratepayers, to avoid environmental disaster, and end this long and burdensome receivership. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Barris. Do we have any questions for the panel? Senator Nelson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, one of the questions I'd like to ask is basically in the most simplest forms of the impact to the ratepayer and the community. First of all, the question that I'd like to ask is in the bill we forego our process with PUC, and I don't see anyone representing PUC up there, so I wanted to know PUC's perspective on this matter and what are the impacts when we forgo PUC, the Public Utilities Commission, who basically set the rates for our power and water, and I'm thinking that they'll set the rates for our solid waste.
I apologize. We didn't call PUC, but I know that it was brought up by the BBMR on the amendment to exclude PUC. I don't know if, ma'am, Senator Lee?
Yes, Mr. Chair, there's testimony from the Public Utilities Commission in the committee report, so they might not have been invited, but they do have testimony on the bill. And that's provided in the committee
Thank you
report.
for the good senator for that statement. I understand that, but I am thinking that not all people that are watching this session have access to the committee report or perhaps even know where to get the committee report, no? So that's why I'm bringing up this question again. We've learned many times as part of this process that people, that the community are sometimes left behind because of matters that are not pushed forward, or perhaps they don't seem, or perhaps the matters becomes an impact so great that we act a little bit too late. We don't understand the impacts initially, and then as the months drag on, we realize, oh my goodness, something happened here, and there wasn't, we didn't have a clear understanding. So I have access to the committee report, but many of the people of Guam, who work every day in and out of their jobs, caring for their families, attending soccer games, and doing everything with their everyday lives, don't have the access or perhaps the time to go through this. And if they're able to go online and watch this session, they'll be able to hear clearly from the PUC's representatives' mouths the impacts or the decision that was made and why this decision was made. Because to tell you the truth, Mr. Chair, as a teacher, I didn't really understand PUC's role in much of anything until I became a senator. And I was the oversight chair. And I was astounded at many of the moves and decisions that were made during these hearings. And as a teacher, I wasn't aware of this. And if I only paid a little bit more attention, then perhaps I would have been standing up a little bit sooner saying, wait a minute, we need to take a closer look here. And maybe all it needs is a simple answer and explanation from them, from the horse's mouth, to appease the people.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We have the sponsor calling. She signaled me she's calling the PUC and inviting them. Okay?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have another question.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Then another concern that I've heard, just speaking with some of the people in our community, is how does this impact our rates? And even as the oversight chair of GSWA, it was also said in many of the hearings, a concern for rate increases once the receivership ends and the government begins to operate the solid waste. And we could not get a definitive answer if rates would be increased. This is without the consideration of having to go to the bond market to build this new cell. This is just in the basis of an initial transfer. When the federal government gives back the Solid Waste Authority, if and when it does, what is the impact to the community? Now we're looking at a bond issue. And so if we can get someone who developed this bill from GITA and BBMR to explain that for the people of Guam, if it will impact the rates, if it will not impact the rates, and if it does impact the rates, how long before we start to see a rate impact? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right. I will start with Mr. Gass first from the Solid Waste And then we would proceed to the GITA folks to answer that. Sir?
First, I'd like to try to address some of the stuff with the PUC. This is Larry Gass with Guam Solid Waste Authority. We will have Mr. Haricki, their attorney, at our board meeting this next week. We have several guidelines that we're entering into agreements with the Public Utilities Commission, and we will be under their responsibility once the receiver is finally ended. We are kind of in a situation where we're in existing contracts that the receiver put in place that were assigned by the court to us, and we will have an independent audit of our entire operation. We'll have a management audit and a financial audit, which then will go to the PUC. That's what I can tell you about that situation as it currently stands with the PUC. The issue with the bonds is if we don't get the landfill built, there will be no solid waste program on this island. There will be no collection, there will be no disposal, because you can't collect the solid waste unless you have some place to put it. And if we run out of space, we have no place to put it. We'll be in violation of EPA regulations again, which would put us back in a situation with a receiver. So we have to have the new cell built in order to continue to operate a solid waste disposal system on the island.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, that was a little bit, oh, I'm sorry, yes.
I was going to have GITA speak in reference to
Forgive me, Mr. Chair, thank you.
Ms. Mignola.
Sure. Is it okay? Yeah? It's okay? Okay, with regard to the bond payment, as you are aware, the bond payments are flat over the life of the credit. So if it's a 12-year bond, payments are flat. Now, when it comes to assessing whether or not the rates need to increase, the increase in rates are generally a function of what is not performing as expected according to plan, because the plan shows that GSWA is able to afford the payments without an increase in rates over the course of the next 5 years, let's say. So if there is an increase in rates, it will not be because of the bond, which is in discussion today. It will be because of shifts from the deviations from the pro forma to the actuals in the future, meaning revenues don't perform as expected, expenses increase unexpectedly, things that are unexpected, things that are not already accounted for in the pro forma. And so with regard to the bond itself, the bond payments are flat over the life of the bond, and yeah.
Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so that doesn't answer the question really, because we all understand, the public understands, the government understands that we do need to build cell 3. So if the general manager for GSWA, Mr.
Gass.
Mr. Gass. So if Mr. Gass is telling us that we do need it and we're not going to be able to pick up trash, it's almost like a gloom and doom story. But really, that's not the issue here. The issue here is we know that there's a need to develop an additional cell. And we also know that there's a need for capital and revenue to develop the cell. The question is now we're given the question was, what is the rate increase or the impact to the rate increase for this amount, for this bond? And the answer that was given was that we don't anticipate to see a rate increase in 5 years, right? We don't, and if there is a rate increase, it's not because we need to settle a debt with the bond. So if that's the case, if the rate increases will not be because of the bond we are going out to borrow, then what exactly or how is the people of Guam going to pay for the bond if we don't anticipate to seeing any rate increases because of the bond? So how is that being paid for?
Okay, let me ask Mr. Gass to explain that. Can you explain, please, how the bill was created? It identified at 12.5 years, and exactly what Senator Nelson is leading to is that Ms. Mendiola identified that it's not expected in 5 years. Can you explain what happens for the duration of the payment of the bond? What can we anticipate or hope not to have happen?
Anyone who is qualified on the panel.
Anyone in
Mr.
the
Chair?
panel?
Thank you, Senator. This is the financial plan that was submitted to the court, and I don't know if the senators have a copy, but there is a section here that does show.
Senator, Mr. Carlson, if I can get the Sergeant Arms to get a copy of that, and let's get it out to all my colleagues. Let's take a couple of minutes, 2 minutes recess while we get that copy circulated so that everybody can see that. Thank you. We're back from recess. For the record, the panel was sworn in at 2:15. Now we'll proceed. My colleagues should have had a copy of the document that Mr. Carlson, we had made copies. Sir, if you would continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I call your attention to page 5, item number 4. This is the GSWA financial projections analysis that was submitted to the court. And basically, it reads, based on GSWA's projected financial statements for fiscal years 2020 through 2024, which the receiver has said to be reasonable, the government believes that based on a pay-as-you-go plan to fund the post-closure needs at ORDOT, in addition to borrowing $30 million for the Luzon Landfill Cell 3, GSWA is able to absorb such debt service and set-aside amounts without the need for a rate increase. This is what we was submitted to the court. This is a product of the U.S. Attorney, U.S. EPA, the receiver, everybody here, working collaboratively to be able to understand, primarily because the U.S. Attorney and U.S. EPA were really adamant about pre-funding as much as possible ORDOT post-closure. And that amount is, we agreed to fund that at a level of $2 million a year. And if you go down on the table, you'll see post-closure care reserves. That's at $2 million a year that's going in to fund the ORDOT post-closure. And then underneath it, you'll see the debt service for the bond, and you'll see the debt service, $3.1 million. And so you take the revenues and the expenditures for the operation, and then you look at what's excess, and then net out the ORDOT post-closure amount that we agreed to and the debt service amount, and you'll see that there is a residual left. And the one thing I'd like to point out for everybody to take a look at is the revenues in fiscal year 2020 are estimated to be $20,250,000. In 2024, it only goes up to $22,006,000. A very nominal increase. I think all of us here can if we take a step back and we look at what is supposed to happen on Guam in 2024 with the expanded population due to the military buildup, this very conservative revenue projection does not reflect that. So we still believe that there is revenue growth potential, but from a very conservative standpoint, I think it was appropriate to put it in a very conservative manner to illustrate. And then also, Mr. Gass has also gone on record about expenditures and how he will be, as opportunities present themselves, taking a look at expenditures and with an eye on efficiencies and cost reductions. So what you're seeing right now is indicative of the current state without Mr. Gass going in there and essentially finding ways to make GSWA a more efficient and reduce the cost at the same time. He believes that he has several opportunities to explore in being able to actually achieve that goal. He stated that on a number of occasions. So for the record, this is what we presented. The statement at the end is the statement that we would like to resonate before this body today. And again, we are able to do this, and we're here before you to seek your approval for this issue, and we do not see a need for a rate increase.
Senator Nelson, does that answer your question? Because I was going to ask the GITA folks to explain a little bit about the funding on the base closure fee and how it stretches out. Ms. Mendiola, if you could please explain that.
Sure. So if you look at page 4, you see the $2 million set aside for post-closure care is $2 million a year up until 2026. And in 2027, it's $166,000. So there should be some pressure alleviated from this $2 million set aside for the post-closure of Audit.
Can you please repeat that?
Sure. If you look at page 4, so the 2 million that's being currently set aside for post-closure care for audit, that is set to be completely funded by August of 2027 at 166,666. So from 2027 onward, so you'll have the bond payment outstanding for another, let's see, 2019, 2031, 4 more years after that. So it'll alleviate the $2 million that you were having to pay.
Thank you.
Senator Nelson did that?
I have a couple.
Okay.
I have a couple more questions, Mr. Chair. I thank you, Lester and Mel, for that explanation. It shows in page 5 the excess available for post-closure debt service is 5.172. So here we have the revenues for FY 2020 for GSWA is 20,250,886. And then less, which is expenditures, less the expenditures, is 15,078,703. So there's an excess of $5.172 million. And so out of that $5.172 million, $2 million will go to post-closure care reserves, and then the debt service to pay off the $30 million bond that we anticipate for cell 3, which is 2.9. What is the reserves at right now? And how far back from receivership has the reserves been building?
Senator, there are 2 types of reserves currently. There are, as Mel Mendiola pointed out on page 4, those are the set-asides for the ORDOT post-closure. And then there are some set-asides for things like new cell development, closure of cells 1 and 2, and I think vehicle replacement, things of that nature. But all of those things are basically funded for future operational use. When we looked at what was available from reserves, cash, to assist with this effort, we were provided information by GSWA that there's about $373,000 that is available to utilize for any cell 3 construction needs.
Okay, perhaps that was the terms that were set by the receivership, right? I understand that the receivership was setting aside money throughout the years for a specific purpose. And initially that specific purpose was for additional cells. Now we're going out, we're saying that this reserves that that the receiver set aside is no longer for the additional cell. It is to post-closure cell 1 and 2, and now we are taking out a bond for cell 3. And so I'm wondering, what is the current reserve at right now from all the money that the receiver has been setting aside?
What the receiver has been setting aside has been a US EPA required RCRA requirement for long-term care and closure of cells 1 and 2 of Lejeune and of ORDOT. They have been putting a little bit of money, which is not mandatory, towards new cell development. That's not in the regulation. The closure and long-term care are in the federal regulations that have to be performed.
I guess I'm just asking for the number. I thought there was like, excuse me, I thought there was like $5 million or $3 million set aside in the reserves. Am I wrong that for that purpose? I'm asking for the dollar figure. What is the reserve at right now for that dollar figure that the receiver has been setting aside? Am I asking the wrong question? Do we not know it?
Answer for that in relationship. Ricky?
Yeah, based on some data, sorry, this is Ricky from GITA, Ricky Hernandez GITA. Based on some of the data that was provided by Kathy Kakigi, who's the CFO of the Solid Waste Authority, just so that it's a little bit clearer that, and just to clarify some of the things, there is, like Lester was mentioning, there are different reserve accounts that have been set aside by the receiver that have since been transferred over to solid waste post partial receivership ending, and one of them is related to the ORDOT dump post-closure care reserve. That one specifically has not been transferred over yet. That's part of the partial receivership. That one is separate and apart from, I guess, the discussion of leads-on landfill in general. That one specifically for ORDOT dump. In that one, there's, as of end of February, there's 6.2 million in that fund, separate, can't be used for leads-on landfill. As it relates to the leads-on new cell development, there's a fund for that. As Lester said, as of February 28, there's 365,000 in that fund. There are other funds that are on reserve, but those are obviously for other specific items, such as equipment replacement, leads-on post-closure care account, which is not specific to the construction of leads-on, but I believe, at least in terms of the titles of these funds that were provided by Solid Waste, the new cell development that is assumed to be available is 365,000 for just new cell development, which...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One last question.
Go ahead.
The trustee, there is a trustee required as part of the perhaps court requirements. And I understand that there's been some back and forth whether who is going to be the trustee. Now, the trustee is in place for the monitoring at ORDOT dump for the gas emissions there, and also to receive all the money that is collected and ensure that GSWA and whoever's monitoring ORDOT dump receives that appropriation / allotment. Who is going to be the trustee on top to hold all this money that the government receives?
Okay, I'll have Ms. Mendiola answer that.
Senator, the trustee to which you're referring is outside the scope of this particular bond issuance. So you're talking about the trustee with regard to the audit post-closure. The receiver is currently looking for a trustee, so the selected trustee has to have what are called, they have to maintain RCRA compliance. RCRA stands, I forgot what RCRA stands for, but it's an EPA requirement. So it's basically a trust profile, a trust account wherein EPA, the U.S. EPA signs off on distributions, and the distributions are made to support audit post-closure. So that's outside the scope of this particular bond issuance. It's specific to the $2 million annual that's set aside. So the trustee would maintain that money. The trust account would house that money, and the trustee would file the required paperwork, or the required paperwork would need to be filed in order for distributions to be made with that trust, making sure that it's compliant with the EPA. And currently, the status of that is that the receiver is currently assessing the market for bank trusts that are capable of handling the RCRA requirements under the U.S. EPA.
Do we know what bank that will be?
We don't as of yet. They're checking some of our local banks in addition to off-island banks.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. Do I have any other questions from any of my Senator Lee?
Sujos Masi, Mr. Chair, and Sujos Masi to the author of Bill 79 for bringing this measure forward for our discussion. I also want to thank the members of the panel who are here to answer a question. My first question is about exigency. So given that we are considering setting aside a significant, extensive expert analysis that would happen under the PUC pre-approval process, which we designed to protect the government or to protect us as a government, we are setting aside also the consideration of this huge debt by our voters. I'm trying to understand the extent of the urgency of this matter. And so I guess my question, Mr. Chair, is did Justice Gatewood order that the release from receivership is contingent upon us securing this financing? I know that this financing plan was submitted to the court for their review. So I just wanted to see if the release from receivership is contingent upon this plan moving through or this bill passing.
Senator, Mr. Carlson?
Thank you, Senator Lee. Yes, this is a prerequisite for exit, full exit out of the receivership. You are correct. We are currently under partial receivership. Day-to-day operations are now vested with GSWA. But in order to fully close the door on the receivership and leave that chapter behind, we really do need to provide the funding for the new cell. And we also needed to come up with a mutually acceptable funding source for the ORDOC post-closure. We were able to work collaboratively with the federal government, and we made a joint report to the court on May 8th. When Judge Gatewood read the report, I think she started out the hearing by saying hallelujah. So we are well on our way to seeing ourselves out of receivership. This is a prerequisite. She needs to make sure that before she withdraws all the conditions of the receivership, that everything that needs to be put in place, including and very importantly, the funding for Cell 3, is in fact done.
Sujos Masi, Mr. Chair. I also had a question about alternate loan financing authorization. So I know that Gita had indicated in their written testimony on this bill as introduced that it would seek GEO bond financing. So I'm just curious as to why the amended version still includes alternate authorization for a short or long-term loan financing. So is it the bond plus a loan or the bond or a loan? I'm just trying to figure out what we're authorizing in this measure and to be very clear about that.
Thank you. Ms. Mendiola?
Yes, thank you, Senator. The loan is a backstop in the event that there's a delay or something happens with regard to the issuance of the bonds, so that we don't have to come back for another, for legislation to authorize the loan. So it's important to understand that credit facilities, whether it's the instrument that changes, but the facility remains the same. It's credit utilized for some purpose. So the loan and the bond accomplish the same thing. The loan language is in there primarily in the event that there is some issue, unforeseen issue with regard to the issuance of the bond.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, if I still have time, I have a question about useful life.
You have a lot of time. You've only used 50 seconds for 2 questions. I'm only measuring the question, not the
Just
discussion. All right?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In terms of useful life, I'm not sure who on the panel could answer this question, but what is the useful life of the cell that we are proposing to build? And a secondary question to that are, what are the kind of considerations that we use in making the determination of the useful life of the cell?
Mr. Gass?
The expected life expectancy is approximately 10 years. That is based on the engineering estimate of the waste growth within Guam over the next 10-year period, which that would be from an increase in population, increase in tourism, things like that. As the cells get larger, as the base of the landfill gets larger, you're able to go higher. So you'll be able to get more life out of it in the future, but you've got to build a new cell to get extra life out of that cell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gass. You mentioned that this takes into consideration our current tourism industry, and does it also take into consideration what we're expecting in terms of the proposed military buildup?
It does not take into account the military buildup.
So the potential is for less than 10 years. Is that correct?
It could last less, but if that happens, then you would have more revenue coming in, which would allow the bonds to be paid off early and to start your construction of your new cell, because you'd be increasing your revenue stream coming in.
I understand. Thank you very much for that. Under both of the financing options presented, both the bond and the loan, is it possible that the 12.5-year term exceeds the useful life of the proposed cell?
The 12.5 years is more than the life of the useful cell, but it includes the construction period.
So 2 years for construction, 24 months for construction, and then 10.5 years for the useful life?
Correct.
And is this common? Is it common to have the useful life of a cell exceed what it would cost to pay off?
I have one thing that I've never borrowed money to build a cell.
I've never borrowed $30 million either, Mr. Gass. That's why I'm asking all these questions.
The problem is you've got to build the cell and have the money to construct it before you can start using it. And that's where the 12 years comes in, is because it takes 2 dry seasons to construct it, and that would be the 2 years. Then it would be in operation for 10 years. That's how you got to finance. We can't start constructing it without the money.
I understand. And hindsight is 20/20, so you can see the...
Correct.
I have one last question, Mr. Chair, and it's with regard to rates. So the current pledge on BPT revenue, and this is probably best answered by Gita, but the current pledge on BPT revenue would be violated if the legislature cut the BPT below 3% before the BPT bonds mature. Would the legislature be prevented from cutting GSW rates in the same way if this financing package passes as proposed? So we discussed the possibility of increasing rates, but what about the possibility of decreasing rates to our ratepayers?
We would have to defer to bond counsel to answer that question at that point in time. Having said that, it's important to recognize that this is a GO bond, a general obligation bond, which is backed by the full faith and credit of the government of Guam. And so, unfortunately, I can't give you an answer for that on cutting rates, only that unlike, in the sense that because it's a general obligation bond, that would certainly be taken into much consideration prior to our bond counsel weighing in on whether or not you can make rate adjustments downward.
Sujos Masi. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and hoping to get
Your
an
second
opportunity
round, huh?
on second round. Sujos
Okay,
Masi.
yeah, you used 2 minutes and 50 seconds. Okay, so everybody understands we're measuring your question, not the discussion. Senator Turley, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And so my first question then is to follow up on this general obligation bond that this is. At first, I thought it was a revenue bond, that it was going to be solely relying on the revenue made by the solid waste in tipping fees. But it's clear from the language of the bill that it's actually pledging the full faith and credit of the government. So if I may ask Gita, it seems to me that then the bill will potentially impact our ability to borrow for other urgent projects, such as the hospital or any other item. And how does this bill then affect our borrowing cap? Does it?
Ms. Mendiola or Ricky, either one of you.
So because this is a general obligation bond, it does have an impact on the amount available under the debt ceiling. As of GITA's most recent debt abstract, which is as of November 2018, the available amount under the debt ceiling for future obligations, that's after taking into consideration the already approved financings, which includes the labor and delivery award. The amount that's available is $226.7 million under the debt ceiling. And so this would take it down by the amount borrowed.
30 million? I guess maybe, bad on me, but I was not aware of that during the public hearing on this bill, and I just read it more carefully after the public hearing, so that's very surprising to me. So I know that the sponsor of the bill in our opening statement read that it's because of the receivership that we need to do this. Do you think it's possible? And then the bill says the bonds may alternatively or additionally be secured by. What do you think the likelihood of that is? Can we avoid that, in other words, and save our bond borrowing, non-revenue source bond borrowing for other projects?
Just to kind of give a background on the reason why a general obligation bond was that was the path that was taken. Obviously, we looked at all of the available avenues to borrow this amount of money, and we did consider the revenue bond aspect, but obviously, given the time constraints of borrowing, the revenue bond, just a bond solely backed by the solid waste tipping fees, would have taken quite a bit of time, just because they're a new credit. They haven't been established. It's something very similar to the Port Authority bond, which was a very new bond. And so it would have taken, I believe the estimate, if I'm not mistaken, was about 9 months to borrow a revenue bond. And so the structure of this bond is very much, and we've been using the example of a parent with a child that wanted to take out a loan for a car. And it's simply the parent is offering its credit to the child to get the car. The child will pay the.
Are you going to go out with a general obligation bond for sure? Have you decided that, or is there any way you can just stick to the revenue bond?
It's the way the bill's written. It's authorizing just a general obligation bond. Yeah.
I thought it's saying alternatively or additionally may be secured by, but it's being pledged first and foremost with revenue bond. So didn't it only take the port a few months to get their bond? How long did it take the port? Because I remember when they were here and then they were in the news celebrating their bond.
It's important to understand that the port has had 5 years of clean audits and they're a revenue-producing entity, whereas GSWA, this is a new, not necessarily a new, it's a new credit for them. And they're coming out, they're still transitioning from receivership. So all of these kind of start to complicate the situation with regard to being able to issue a revenue bond. So that's why it was decided that this would be a general obligation bond.
I guess I want to know how that decision was made. What was put in front of you? Was it very concrete that you were not going to be able to get it done in time, or is it very concrete that the bond market was not going to go for a revenue bond?
There were a number of factors, but primarily the financial plan collaboration team, which was made up of all the different parties, including GSWA, GITA, BBMR, DOA, the receiver, the US EPA, and as well as Bond Council. We explored different options from the perspective of two things, primarily pricing and pricing and timing. And it was based on those two criteria, pricing and timing, the decision was made to go with a general obligation bond. But yes, we did do a side-by-side comparison. The revenue bond, the estimate was that it would take longer to be able to secure a revenue bond, and that is why we decided to go with the general obligation.
Do you, so do you recall how long it took the ports to confirm its bond?
That was before my time, but perhaps Mr. Carlson,
Yeah, it was
do
just
you
a few
recall how
months
long
ago.
the port bond took? I think it was 2 years, to be perfectly honest, from the
No.
time of the Tiger grant to the time of
No,
the
because
securing
those
the
were
bond.
different. They were just here a few months before they went for the authority and
Yeah.
went out to go get that.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. The time that it took to get to the legislature, I think Ms. Mendiel is correct. It was 2 years of work before they could approach the legislature with an understanding of how they're going to fund the projects there. You are correct. Once the authorization was provided, I think it took like 4 months from the time the authorization was provided to then structuring all the different financings and then going at the ratings and all that stuff. So that was a 4-month process. We don't have the luxury of 4 months, unfortunately.
So you think this bond, you're going to float it in less than 4 months?
We need to do this
Before
in July.
rainy season?
In
So
July.
is that
That's
something
correct.
feasible?
Yeah.
That's correct. We're trying to finish it have it be funded by Liberation Day,
What a
or
feat
right
that
around
will be.
Liberation.
All right, well, I'm very concerned because, using the 226 now, I guess we're below 200 million in capacity to borrow. I'm just very concerned. So, of course, I think it's important if we can avoid the general obligation to avoid that, and especially in these cases where we actually do have a solid revenue stream. And would it be possible later on to convert? I don't know, never mind. I'll bring that up later, but we do, I mean, you know more than I do, as well as I do, that we have other very pressing issues that we also may need to consider funding. All right, what about the operation budget? At first, it was my understanding from the public hearing that we were going to pay these bonds off by saving in operations compared to the current operations under the receiver. But now it looks like from this is the first time we've seen these financial projections that was provided to the court. So now it's very clear that actually we can continue operations at the same rate and even a slight increase every year. But I wanted to ask you, Mr. Gass, because I think it was you who represented that you would be able to that there would be some savings in operations by converting from the receiver. Is it possible, is there any plan that you've submitted that shows that the potential savings by converting from the receiver over to operation by the government of Guam? In operations?
There is no plan been developed because May 1st is when we just got control of Guam Solid Waste Authority. We are just now getting through finishing signing over bank accounts that the trustee has turned over to us. We're just now in the process of getting started. But he does have contracts that I feel are unnecessary, that we will be eliminating them as soon as our opportunity to eliminate the contracts occur.
Can you give me an example?
We have a security contract that watches the compound where all the equipment is stored, because after the receiver took over, there was a lot of vandalizing of the equipment, which caused delays and increased repair costs, so they instituted a security system, a guard. And I'm looking at moving that if we need security and cameras won't work, then I will move personnel to that, which would be able to fuel the trucks at night, grease the trucks at night, to perform actually a function there without just being a guard and an expense. It would actually be a benefit to us at a reduced cost.
Ms. Mendiola, as part of the pro forma, is that the term, pro forma, that you will be presenting to the bond market, I'm guessing, that you're saying it's kind of like the projections for 5 years. Do you do that type of analysis to show how operations is going to be maintained at this level and not exceed this level? Or any kind of projections that might show savings in operations?
For our projections, because it's a general obligation bond, it is primarily on the creditworthiness of the government of Guam, so there isn't as much analysis to the day-to-day operations or the sensitivity of the operations of GSWA.
Do you have any assurance that operations will not exceed the amounts that are being projected here for the next, until 2024 at least?
I think that with a newly appointed board and a newly appointed GM, that there is quite a bit of oversight in areas of enhancing revenue as well as controlling cost. And so I guess if the question is, am I confident in their ability to attack their expenses aggressively, then yes, I'm confident in their ability to do that.
Well, I was hoping to be confident in that also, but after the public hearing, when that was represented, I realized that we really had not seen anything, and as he says, he just started it, they just are taking over the accounts now, so I guess I'm beginning to wonder. I'm just hoping, of course, that our costs are not going to go up unexpectedly. Of course, you expect to bring them down, and I'm very much hoping they're not going to go the other way unexpectedly, and then all these promises of no rate increases completely changes overnight.
There was also, Senator, concurrence from the receiver that the pro forma was reasonable with regard to the projections.
Is there a pro forma?
Or with that?
This?
Yes, that's
All right.
correct.
On page 4, they talk about, and throughout the bill, they added these terms. It says the bonds or the authority's obligations with respect thereto. So I understand that this was added by bond counsel's recommendation. But what obligations, can you be specific with us what obligations these are going to be for this particular bond? It says the authority's obligation, meaning solid waste authority? I didn't.
Yes, that's correct.
No. Does that include, what other costs might that include?
Can you repeat that, Senator Lai?
Yes, so on page 4, it's repeated again on page 6. They add these language to, about the bonds. I'm on page 4D, subsection D. It says the bonds or the authority's obligations with respect thereto. So that language, or authority's obligations with respect thereto, I'm just asking what obligations are included under that language for this bond? Because it seems to be that we're pledging to cover the bonds and obligations, which is just a general term here. So I want to know, what does that entail?
We are not sure. That's well.
If you could
We'll get back to you on that.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Lester, perhaps from other bonds, what did that include?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. And for the public's benefit, we're on subsection D, source of and security for payment. So as Senator Talahi was mentioning, this begins on page 3, then carries into page 4. So under the heading of source of and security of for payment, the language reads, in addition to the statutory lien provided for above, any or all or any part of the pledged revenues may be pledged if and to the extent determined by the Governor of Guam to secure the payment of any bonds or obligations of the authority. So what we're talking about consistently, going back to page 1, under pledged revenue, and above that, the authority. So we're continuing to say that what is the primary source of repayment for the bonds is revenues of the system.
Correct. But what is the obligation in addition to the bonds that we are securing with our pledged revenues?
There might be some accounts that are set up for escrows and other things and other obligations that are tied to this. So, it's an all-encompassing language.
All
But again, what we're talking about doing here is depositing $30 million
Yes.
into an account for the construction of the new Cell 3. And anything else, I think,
Right.
is what
That's
is
what
covered
I'm
by
trying to just confirm. What are that anything else? What are those other obligations? And hopefully then Gita will get a language to us. But Mr. Chair, if I may ask, so on page 10 of the bill, subsection L, I believe, L says, it's talking about the use of the proceeds from the sale of the bonds. So it says that the sale of the bonds will be used, of course, to finance the cell project. Then it says, establish any necessary reserves in connection with the foregoing project. And I'm curious why it doesn't list what these necessary reserves are. And so if we could have those for the record, which necessary reserves will be funded from proceeds of the bond? And why is that necessary? It seems to me we are already funding several reserves from our revenues in general.
Yeah, Ricky?
So when we were going over this, the necessary reserves was just an option if it's necessary. Typically, you'd have some debt service reserves if that was necessary, but as it relates to this specific issuance, there isn't any plan to put any reserves aside, but we wanted to, and based on bond council discussion, we wanted to ensure that that was an option if it was necessary, but there is no plan to put any reserves aside.
When will it be deemed necessary? When you're out there in front of, trying to market these, or when does that determined?
Given the tight timeline, I know that we're trying to secure these bonds sometime in July. That determination may happen sooner than later. So, yeah, within the next 2 months, at the latest, within the next 2 months.
May I still, Mr. Chair?
Yes, you
Thank
still
you.
got a lot of time.
All right, so back to the operations, if I could just ask. So this bond is, of course, it looks great. We're going to go out for $30 million. We're going to borrow. I thought it looked great because we were going to pledge revenues, right? But what doesn't make it look so great is that we're also pledging our, good faith and credit, our general obligation of the government of Guam. So we're in fact, bringing down our potential for other borrowing, for other urgent projects. The other thing is that we in no way through this bond are addressing the original bond that was taken out for Luzon, which when it was designed was obviously supposed to do just like this, pay for the debt service through the revenues. But that did not happen, nor was sufficient money put aside after passage of that bond with the receiver to cover this Cell 3, which I'm pretty sure was also anticipated at that time, that this was all planned out, it just didn't come through. So I've heard different explanations like, well, the receiver had to spend the money on unexpected items that came up, such as recycling program and other, maintaining trucks, different types of programs. But I guess I want to know if any of you have done any analysis enough to tell us whether, then if we could actually save in the operations of the solid waste, like I thought was being predicted, could we use part of that savings then to cover part of the debt obligation that we are currently covering with the general fund? Every year I've heard in the budget, discussion that that's ideal, that we are looking to solid waste revenues to pay off the solid waste portion of that bond. For different reasons, it's never been able to happen, and I'm wondering if after we do this, if we could, that might be a possibility, that we're converting now out of receivership, if we could have any savings that could go towards paying off that first bond. Have any calculations been made in that regard? Any potential discussion on that?
Does anyone, I see Lester here. Go for it, Lester.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. As everybody may recall, we were getting a reimbursement from the 2009 bonds. And you're correct, ma'am. The receiver did petition the court for use of that money for like the Darrow Road project and other things that he thought were important, and therefore he got the court's permission to be able to redirect the monies that were supposed to come back to the government of Guam. And it's an unfortunate situation. There isn't anything left, and the only way for us to be able to begin even considering a reimbursement for what we for the debt service that for the 2009 bonds is if there's a rate adjustment. So it's kind of like, on one hand, you'd like to be able to get the general fund revenues back like they were supposed to have been done, but where we are today, all things being equal, if we did that, it would result in a rate increase, and we're trying real hard to avoid that.
Unless perhaps we have some savings in operations, right? If they are significant. Now, I know that you've told me, Mr. Gash, if there are any savings, you might want to use that to plan for the next cell and other projects. So I understand, but I'm saying if we could keep that on the table, Gita, please, if when you're preparing whatever financials, if you could always make that a potential obligation from these revenues, right? So that we can clear up the general fund revenues for other projects such as the hospital. Fine. Just one more question, Mr. Chair. If you want me to give it now,
No. You still got
thanks.
time.
So my final question is about the fees, as Lester brought up. So we're getting promises here that fees will not be raised because we're able, according to this, to cover this. That it looks great. Except that, we're bypassing PUC for now, but I just heard that we're contracting with PUC for a management audit and a financial audit. And does that, how soon, and then this only goes up to 2024, so I guess, and then you talked about a pro forma that's good for 5 years, so my question is, how soon are you looking at getting, how soon is PUC coming in to tell us, we did your financial audit, we did your management audit, and you need to raise your fees? How soon might that happen? It sounds to me like that might happen the day after you get your bond based on this. I don't know, it just seems so flexible, no real guarantee.
The way it was explained to me is we would have 6 months to have the management audit and stuff done once the receiver is totally gone.
All right. And do you expect at the end of a management audit potential suggestion from PUC or any kind of analysis from PUC in that management audit regarding fees?
My understanding of the way that the PUC works is that they're just basically looking to make sure that there is no anomalies, that we would have to actually request a rate increase for them to make a recommendation of that.
Okay. And what about, this is just a side question, this is management audit, what are they auditing if we are just beginning? I'm curious about that. I think I heard Mr. Gill talk about that too, but it's just dawning on me now. What exactly are they auditing in management if we're just beginning a new program with new, right? We're converting over right now.
That's what it is, but they'll basically look and see what the structure is to make sure that there's qualified people in place, that the workforce is what industry standard is, that we don't have too many people, we don't have too few people, that we've got the policies and procedures in place for the operation.
Right.
Those are the kinds of things they'll look at in the management audit.
And the costs for those audits do not change your financial projections.
Not at all.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much to the panel.
Thank you. I think I saw the hand of Senator Kelly Mars Tainu, and then followed by Senator Amanda Shelton. Ma'am.
Sujus Masi. I have a few questions here. So I just want to be reassured that we have looked at this as thoroughly as possible. Are there any potential costs or overruns that thus far we have not factored in that could be occurring in the design, build, and project management of the construction of Cell 3?
Mr. Gass.
We currently are not involved in the construction choice process. The court has ordered the receiver to negotiate and enter into the construction contract.
So, okay, I had not realized that. That's a very interesting situation. With that, with the way that construction tends to go, perhaps learning lessons from the way that construction went for Cell 1 and Cell 2, were there any, or do you see that that might be a potential issue of having those costs that have not yet been factored in and may hit us?
There could be on any construction project, there can be that situation, but then you also have the opposite possible to where field changes could be made to lessen the scope of the contractor. And with that type of a situation, you could have increases or you could have decreases within the value of the contract.
Okay, and that helps segue into my next question. With the bond itself, so this would be for Gita, with the bond itself, are there any indirect costs or ancillary costs in floating the bond, any administrative costs that have not yet been factored into this projected $30 million cost that you think we need to be considering, or that we should at least be aware of that could be coming up? Bond counsel cost or closeout costs, something along those lines?
Those have been factored in.
Okay. So with that, getting back to what you were saying, that there's the potential for decrease in the cost of it all. So if the whole bond amount is not used, who would be the beneficiaries of that, or what would that process be like if the whole $30 million is not needed?
Well, the bonds have to be used for their specified purposes under the bond indenture. So in the event, the bond, if the bond indenture does not, if the bond indenture, because you're working with, a bond is specifically this general obligation bond, and in any municipal type of offering is a tax-exempt type of instrument. So given that the uses for these funds is very limited, and so if there were not, if the entire credit wasn't utilized, being able to reprogram would likely be dependent on whether or not the uses are would fall under tax-exempt uses as stated in the bond indenture. So we'd have to confer with bond counsel before reprogramming anything. And currently it's all for GSWA. It's not planned to go anywhere else. Well, it's GSWA and any issuance fees associated with that.
So just Masi for that. I'm glad that we addressed the issues of whether ending receivership and this borrowing regime could help save monies for the government and the taxpayers, of course. If anybody has anything to add to that in other possible ways of saving monies by ending the receivership, I certainly would like to hear about it, but then I have perhaps just one last question after that.
Mr. Gas?
Ending the receivership is what's going to save us money. We're going to have $1.5 million a year that we've been paying the receiver to help pay the bonds. The receiver has been getting that money every year for overseeing and operating the system. Then, as I said before, the contracts that he has in place, I've already been going through them, but he's got numerous contracts, and I've got to cross-reference and go to addendums that they have, and it's very time-consuming for me as one person trying to go through everything that the receiver had. I still haven't found all their documents yet that I'm in need of, and have made requests to the receiver to get those documents. As I keep going, I may find more and more things that I can make savings with, and that's what my intent. But a good portion of the bond will be paid for from the receiver's fee.
So just Masi, that's reassuring to hear. Of course, we never know the complete picture until the situation is upon us and we're going through it. The last question that I have, and perhaps it was one that was explored, but I don't remember hearing about it through some of the different meetings that we've been having all along as we've been getting ready for this bill. Is there a feasible option for the Guam Retirement Fund to participate or be offered the purchase of any of the bonds?
So this is, again, it's a tax-exempt bond, and within the Government of Guam Retirement Fund, what you have, when you save for retirement, that's a tax-deferred situation already. And so because this is a tax-exempt bonds are primarily meant for corporations or individuals facing significant tax liability. And so given that, it's not unheard of for retirement funds, et cetera, to pick up municipal offerings or municipal holdings, but they generally don't need the triple tax-exempt status.
So it did sound like you were saying it's not impossible.
Correct. It's not impossible, but it's
All
not.
right.
There are other alternatives that would provide a better return to the retirement fund, all things being equal.
And does any of that wash out with, I mean, it's all government money, it's all taxpayer money, it's all meant to serve the people. Does any of that balance out that we might save in one sense by going through the retirement, even though on the other hand, there might be somewhat lower returns, but
There would be an inherent conflict of interest for a retirement fund that's meant to protect the interests of their retirees to hold this type of position for the benefit of the agent, for the benefit of a sister brother agency.
Okay, well, that helps me understand that a little bit better. So, Sujuis Maasi, and those are the questions that I have for right now.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Amanda.
Sujuis Masi, Mr. Chair, and Sujuis Masi to the panel for being here today to answer all of our questions. For Mr. Carlson, can you tell us what was the cost of cell 1 and 2? And because my understanding is cell 3 is the same amount of space as cell 1 and 2. Can you tell us what we paid or what we're paying for 1 and 2 right now?
Thank you, Senator. You got me there because I don't remember.
Okay.
You know, okay.
Mr. Burns.
So 1 and 2, it's about 71 million.
Okay, alrighty. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then, Mr. Carlson, you also mentioned a little earlier that in the court, the judge was pleased because you identified the funding source for the post-closure, right? Can you tell us what that funding source is? I'm sorry if I missed it.
No, that's okay. But one clarification on the cost. Mr. Byrne
Okay.
is correct, but remember the 71 million included, you know, having to make all the infrastructure improvements and the, you know, all the associated roadways and paving and all that other kind of stuff that went into the building of the first 2 cells. So we have all that infrastructure in place now, so we don't need that much money to build cell 3.
Yes, I figured because it seems like we'd be saving a lot of money if it's the same amount of land. So I
Yes.
figured it was all of those things for the initial costs.
Yes. So going back to your question on post-closure, if there was one element of this discussion that we've had going since the first week of March with the governor going into district court to try to pick up where we needed to pick up and move this thing forward, right? The federal government, more than anything else, is like really hung up on the post-closure care of ORDOT. They want to make sure that there's leachate testing, there's methane gas capturing, there's all kinds of other things to avoid any violations of the Clean Air or Clean Water Act. So there's a substantial interest in being able to make sure that the amount of money, which was again contained on page 4, it's like $21 million plus, is going to be available very soon to be able to take care of post-closure care for like the next 30 years. So that was probably our biggest, you know, back and forth, because if we had borrowed an additional $10 million to put into with the $6-7 million that the receiver has, we would have cut the debt service or the post-closure care down to $1 million, right? But it would have been for, you know, 12 years, and cash funding it gets us there in 7. So there was some cash relief that we thought might be a plus for GSWA, but at the same time, I think it was Ricky in our last meeting where we were told that because of the RCRA requirements, the amount should have been fully deposited in 2009. And so we were like, oh, okay. Anyways, yeah, so post-closure costs from the federal government standpoint is every bit as important to them as the new cell.
Okay.
Maybe a little bit more.
Okay, and so that's identified as a cost of $2 million annually, right?
Yes.
Is there any other unresolved costs that we should anticipate, maybe over the $2 million?
30% adjustment.
Okay.
It's an extremely cushioned amount.
All right, very good. Okay, so I understand how critical the need is for the bond and for this cell to move away from receivership, and I know there's a whole plan and other requirements. So can you elaborate a little bit more on what those other steps are to move away from receivership? Mr. Gass, maybe.
Right now, the main thing that we're looking at to move away from receivership is a method for approving and authorizing payments to the contractors that will be maintaining the ORDOT facility. We have a plan in place that will basically make EPA, Guam EPA, the organization that will authorize the trustee to make the payments to the contractors that are performing the work at ORDOT. This would be approved. US EPA and Guam Solid Waste Authority would have 7 days to concur or to raise an issue. If not, it would be an automatic concurrence, and Guam EPA would issue the payment. The reason that they're looking at Guam EPA to do it is they want to try to keep non-governmental entities, non-regulatory entities out of it. And since Guam EPA is the one who will issue the long-term care permit for it, they know what the requirements are. The fund will also pay for an independent engineer that will review for Guam EPA the actual costs and say that that's legitimate, that's correct, so that they have an expert that's going to be their personnel. That's the way it's kind of setting right now. There's probably a few more details that got to be worked out because it's Guam EPA, US EPA, US Attorney, you know, everybody's trying to work together to get this solved. But once that happens, once the money's moved over into the trust, we will probably be totally out of the receivership. We will still be under the consent decree from the court, so we will still have to answer to the court, but we will not be under the control of the receiver anymore.
All right, thank you very much, and thank you to all of you, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Shelton. We'll take a few minute recess, and we'll be back. The committee is back from recess. We have a Mr. Leon Guerrero from EPA. Sergeant Arms, could you please bring him in and swear him in? Thank you, Sergeant Arms. For the record, it is 4:23, and Mr. Leon Guerrero has been sworn in from EPA. We will now move to Senator Moylan, followed by Senator Tideway. Okay?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question is for Mr. Gass, and just so I'm understanding, I just want to further understand. Now, the more tonnage you get, as long as our economy grows, the more revenue you generate to pay for our bond, right, I suppose?
That's correct. We are more of a business than most utilities. Most utilities have guaranteed customers. Everybody's hooked up to electricity. Everybody's hooked up to water. So they've got a monthly income that's guaranteed. Ours is strictly based on what people throw away. If you don't throw away anything, our revenues are not as high as if you throw away a lot. That's why the military buildup is good for us. That would be more people throwing items away and would increase our revenue stream.
Okay, thank you. And then we were also previously discussing about how much your revenue comes from households versus commercial. I believe it's 40% from households and 60% from commercial. Is that correct?
Correct. Right now we're getting about 60% commercial waste and 40% residential.
And of that 40% of the residential, I think that was 19,000 resident units that we previously discussed, right?
Correct. And that's approximately half of the dwellings that would fall under our regulations, which is dwellings that are 3 units or less. Anything that's 4 units or more are not covered under our collection. They would fall under the commercial side. So your condominiums, your fourplexes, things like that would fall under the commercial collection program.
How would it help with your revenue if we had 100% of those households paying their tipping fees?
It would be a great situation for the Solid Waste Authority because we would actually realize the economies of scale where we're already driving down a road to pick up 2 or 3 trash cans when we could go down that same road, the same expense for fuel, for mileage on the truck and stuff, and pick up 7 or 8 cans. And it would be a great benefit. That would be a way that the rates could end up being lowered for homeowners, is because then you have that economy of scale and you're not having to drive down a half mile to pick up 1 can. You drive down a half mile and you pick up 7 or 8 of them, and you've got that revenue source for driving the same distance.
Okay. Mr. Carlson gave conservative growth, and we're hoping it can grow that way, and it looks pretty positive on a conservative level. But at the same time, we can't say things will work out the way we want to. And if the economy goes down, would it help if we had all the residents paying for their pickup?
That's the thing that affects us more than it does anybody else. If we are in a growing, calm, or even a stable economy, we'll stay right about exactly the same. Our revenue forecasts, everything will be the same. If we go into a situation where we go into a recession like in 2008, 2009, when the housing bubble burst, we would lose a lot of revenue. When I was with Orange County at that time, we went from 1.2 million tons a year to 750,000 tons a year, which is a tremendous loss of garbage. If people aren't buying new stuff, they're not throwing out the old stuff. And if they're not throwing stuff away, there's no revenue being generated. The other thing that can have a negative impact on us is if you have a high inflation rate, because there's a delay in responding with government to increases in prices. If diesel fuel doubles in price, that's going to be a tremendous hit that would take a long time for me to be able to recover those costs.
If you were able to get 100% of the households to participate within the next, let's say, following year, what could you do with that additional revenue, considering the economy is projected, like Mr. Carlson was explaining?
I honestly think if we had all of the citizens in the program, all of the single-family households in the program, that we'd be able to pay off the bonds early and maybe even reduce rates some.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Tyree?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the panel that's here today, taking time out of your very busy schedules. Greatly appreciate the work that you're doing for the people of Guam. Appreciate it. I do have a question with regards to if this bill were passed, how much would be, so this is to Gita, how much would we have left to borrow so right now you mentioned earlier about how much money that's left to borrow if 30 million was taken away from that. What will be the available for future debt obligation? If this bill were to pass, what's the amount?
Yeah. A little bit less than 200 million, so like 196 million.
How much? Again, I'm sorry, 100?
196 million left.
Okay, and so my question is, there's a law that caps the amount of money that we can borrow on, and what is that percentage?
Go for it.
I think maybe Gita may want to mention that we're paying off debt. It's not like we're not paying off our bills. So you may want to comment that in relations to that, so that it makes sense. Is just because you borrow today don't mean you're not paying off something you had yesterday. That's something you may want to mention. That, and plus the value of the property of Guam will determine how much money, how much we can borrow.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting to. So what is the percentage, Ricky?
So the way to calculate the debt ceiling is, as it relates to your question on the percentage, is you take 90% of the assessed value of property, and then you take 10% of that amount.
So it's basically 10% of the value of the property. Now, the governor gave us a proposal in the executive budget to do a property reevaluation based on, well, I guess even Lester can answer this. What are the possibilities that this increase can work for us or against us on our debt ceiling? Do you think it's going to be an increase? Or do you think it's going to be a decrease after this property evaluation, considering the climate we're in right now? We know that assets, buildings are going up, but property is going down.
I would venture to say, my gut says that we're going to see an increase. Simply because of, while I understand the H2 issue has been a problem, when I drive around, I'm seeing new construction. And you've got the hotels coming up. That's going to add to the tax rolls. So, you know, we're going to have certain improvements that weren't captured in the last property evaluation. So my gut tells me it's going to go up, and it's going to be a good thing.
Substantial amount, do you think, Lester? Substantial amount, do you think?
I don't know about substantial.
Okay.
We'll wait and see.
Okay, okay, thank you. So, Mr. Gass, you report to a board, correct?
Pardon me, I didn't hear that.
You report to a board.
Yes, I report to the board.
Did you have the board approve any of these tipping fees toward paying off a bond? Did you have the board approve this?
The board is approving that next week.
So they haven't approved it yet. So in other words, you haven't gone to the board and requested to allow this panel to be here today to allow you to utilize the tipping fees toward paying this bond.
They are totally aware of it, and they just have not voted on it yet.
Okay, wow. Go ahead, Lester.
Yeah, Senator, there's actually nothing to vote on just yet. So the board would ratify an action after this body has acted and the governor has acted. So, Andrew Gale, the chairman of the board, there are a couple other members, Dana Gutierrez and Minachi Hemlani. They've all attended recent court hearings. They're all involved in what it is that we're collectively doing.
Mm-hmm.
So they're on board. The board is on board.
The board is on board, but they haven't approved it yet. It would be really nice, though, to have the board approve this before coming in front of us, just to show that there's support. But that's not really a real issue right now with me, because this is a general obligation bond. You gave us a sheet here showing the amounts based on tipping fees, but, it's a general obligation bond. It's going to come from the general fund. So, so my next question then would be, of the funding that you request.
Senator
sure.
Tadwi, the way that we're structuring this, it's not going to be paid from the general fund.
I'm sorry, say again?
This is not going to be paid by the general fund. It is a general obligation bond. Senator Terlahi was correct that we're putting our full faith and credit pledge behind it. But the pledge of revenues, the first pledge of revenues, comes from GSWA. This is why I asked the body to refer to this, because this is the source of payment. It's not, Mr. Byrne and I, we have our feet very firmly planted to ensure that this does not come out of revenues that this body will be, appropriating.
The bond itself, Lester, since we're talking about the bond covenants, in that bond covenant, you are going to specify that in?
Yes, very, very clearly.
But you still need GSWA's approval, right?
Of course.
Okay.
Yes.
So my next question is, Mr. Gass, the funding that has been requested here for $30 million to build the third cell, is any part of the funding set aside for recycling or waste reduction initiatives or program with any of that funding?
That is just the funds that the receiver says the bid came in for the construction of the landfill.
Okay, so my next question is, speaking of the receiver, you mentioned earlier that we're kind of in a partial return back. What was the correct verbiage that you said, how we're in a partial?
Well, the receiver is still partially in charge of parts of the operation of the Guam Solid Waste Authority.
Okay. And then you mentioned that it was the receiver that gets to choose what contractor that goes after, what contractor is used to build the third cell. Is that correct?
That is correct. That was by order of the court.
Is there any possibility, since we're going in this direction, that that GSWA can actually be the ones, or let me go back. Is the receiver required to go under a procurement process, just like everything is scrutinized in the government of Guam when going into contracts?
The receiver has, they do not have to follow the exact same requirements that the other people in Guam, the other organizations in Guam government have to follow. They have special leniency that has been awarded to them by the court, and they have privileges that other people don't.
Mr. Gass, have you reached out to the federal judge asking to have that ability to do it yourself under the procurement laws of Guam as far as, getting this contractor on board?
No, I have not. It's been my priority is to try to work with the receiver, with the judge, to
Mr. Gass,
hurry up the ending
Right.
of the receivership.
and Mr. Grass, you were doing, you mentioned earlier how you're going through, looking at everything, all the past contracts, and you're finding things that are a little excessive and should not be, you're going to be getting rid of because, for cost reasons. I think that you really should send a letter to the federal government asking to take over that particular segment. This money is coming from, in good faith, if it should be passed from the legislature. And I've seen certain costs in the last, I was in the 30th Guam Legislature when we did the bond, the $200 million plus bond for the closure and the opening of the leads on landfill. I was part of that bill. And then throughout, the years, I've watched this receiver and some of the funding used that are very, very, very questionable. So I'm asking if you can, Mr. Gass, look into this about being able to be the one to go through have the ability actually to go through the federal government to ask to do the contract for this.
If the reason the court has instructed the receiver to do it is because the time frame that needs to get done, if we have to start from scratch and go through the RFP process, we will not have the landfill constructed
Enough time.
before we run out of space.
Right before you said that, I saw Lester lean over like that, and I knew exactly what that meant. My question was answered right when he went like that. So, well, that being said, at least, to ensure there's no abuse or, an astronomical amount that's going to be used to this contractor build that landfill, I hope that you stay on top of that. You're doing your due diligence, as I heard earlier. Like I said, you're looking through all these contracts that are not needed, that you also stay on top of this this contract and contractor with the federal federal judge to make sure she also keeps on top of that as well, because that's money that could really be.
The biggest problem is finding people to do construction on Guam right now. The receiver actually put this out twice. He wasn't happy with the price the first time, and he came back, only had one bidder at the same price they bid the first time. So it's an economy that's being driven by high demand right now with the construction that's being paid for by the federal government. And we're unfortunately in a time crunch, and that is costing us probably more money than it should. If we would have planned, if this would have been planned out 4 years ago, we wouldn't be in this kind of a situation that we're having to kind of rush through. And that's what the judge is looking at, is the time constraint that is on the construction.
You had my last question. You actually had my last question, and that question is, why are we doing this in the last minute to do something like this when you knew the landfill was coming to almost full capacity? That why weren't we here last year doing this?
It should have been done 4 years ago. It should have been planned set up, and you should have your new cell built 1 year before your old cell runs out. And that's a standard procedure that I've seen, well,
Man.
that I've used in 35 years of running landfills.
It sounds to me like the next year we're going to be sitting here again for the fourth cell as well. Thank you,
Yes.
Mr. Gass.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Clint, is there any other senator who would like to ask a question? And this will finish the first round after Senator Clint. Senator Clint.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this bond borrowing proposal is being touted as a general obligation bond, but the source of repayment or the source of the payment on the debt service are revenues, correct? So my question is, can you explain to us what makes it a general obligation bond other than just calling it a general obligation bond? What's the specific mechanism that deems it a general obligation bond when the obligation is tied to revenues from the GSWA?
Thank you, Senator. When we issue a general obligation bond, we don't identify a specific fund source. We just say the government of Guam promises to make good on the bond from whatever sources it has available. It is not revenue stream specific. So in this case, we are basically saying, as Mr. Hernandez pointed out earlier, that the market would probably not have any substantial interest in a revenue bond from GSWA. We did think long and hard about this approach. Yes, it is a general obligation bond. If the revenues for some reason are insufficient, the government has to come in and make good. We're structuring a cushion of about a month of debt service so that the monies are in place a month before they're actually needed, so that we are well aware from a cash standpoint what the government of Guam has to do should there be any deficiencies. But for all intents and purposes, you're correct. I think that the way that you could probably look at this again is a general obligation bond is what it is that we're going to be selling, and the source of repayment is really open.
So it sounds like what it is the revenues are the source of payment, right? But should the revenues not be sufficient, then it becomes an obligation of the general fund to find a way to pay it.
That's correct.
So since the main source of payment, though, are revenues, and revenues are generated by tipping fees or rates, shouldn't the PUC be involved in this approval somehow?
You know, the primary concern that we have really is time. The PUC was quiet until we had the public hearing. The PUC could have involved itself earlier on any number of things associated with the Guam Solid Waste Authority. One of the things that their mandate requires them to do is to take a look at financial instruments, contracts. To date, they've been relatively quiet. But once the momentum began, and we could see that the end of the receivership was supposed to, is within sight, they dusted off their mandate under Public Law 34-58, and they started working in earnest with GSWA to lay out all the steps and secure all the contractors necessary to do the management study. So I believe that if we had the luxury of time, then, you know, it's okay, but we don't have the luxury of time. A PUC, first and foremost, we're not saying that there's a rate increase. And as it was stated earlier by Mr. Gast, you see this with GWA. GWA is going to the PUC on a proposed 5-year rate increase to be able to fund their capital needs. So an agency goes to PUC with an idea of what it is that their future needs require with respect to rates. We're not going to the PUC in that regard because we are trying really, really hard to keep the rates where they are.
Right. GWA is going to the PUC for capital improvement projects that will require bond borrowing that will be tied to rates. Hence, that's why they're going to the PUC, right? So in this case, it's being suggested to not go to the PUC because although we are tying it to revenues, if the revenue should fall short, it becomes a general fund obligation to figure out the shortfall. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I believe this ends our first round of questions unless any other senator would like to ask in the first round. Okay, that ended the first round. We'll begin now the second round. Senator Nelson, do you have any questions you want on the second round? None? Senator Lee, do you have any questions? I'm going to call off the names of the senators as they were asking questions. Okay, Senator Lee, do you have any questions? All right, we have Senator Lai. Senator Therese, do you have another round of questions?
Could I ask Mr. Gass, we used the example of the security at one of the facilities as a potential savings event. When can we expect a significant savings event to occur?
Most of them, as the expiration date of the contract approaches, if the way most of the contracts that the receiver had entered into require a year's notice on the anniversary date of the contract. So as those come around, that's what I'm going to try to initiate and get done. Some of them, like the security, did not have, it was an year-to-year type contract. It wasn't a multi-year contract. So that's one that I will be able to start eliminating right away. There's other things that the receiver had set up that I've got to look at to try to change, which would reduce the value of contracts that he has in place that are long-term contracts.
All right. Ms. Mendiola, is it possible that, or does this bill, by the language, restrict solid waste ability to lower tipping fees? For example, I know we have to cover the revenue that we're pledging, but if they're able to do that and lower tipping fees, for example, just generate more business overall and lower residential fees or something like that, is that restricted by the covenants you are looking at?
So you're speaking of a similar situation to wherein, like, for example, when we were interested in lowering the BPT and GITA came back and said that it would be against bond covenants. Because this is a general obligation, it is based on the general creditworthiness of the government of Guam, as opposed to a specific revenue source. Nonetheless, because the pledged revenue is the GSWA, we would likely have to seek bond counsel to explore if that would be an issue in the bond indenture and meeting the bond covenants.
Could you do that right away? I would really like to know the answer to that, because I can't tell from the language, it's not clear, but I think we should know very clearly whether that's what we always find out later on the bonds instead of sooner. Yeah, so I'd appreciate if that's, you can find that answer soon, right?
Yes.
All right. And, so Mr. Gass, I think it was you, they were talking about the potential of we can build cells up after we've established the base. I don't know, Walt, maybe you can talk to this too, but are we able to build up on cells 1 and 2 right now, or what is the plan on that?
Right now, the way you have to visualize this is a pyramid. If you have a pyramid that's got a base this big, you can only build it about this high.
So cell 3 is part of the base?
And as you make the base larger, you can go higher on that pyramid, and that's basically what it is. And as you build your new cell, which expands the base of your pyramid, you're able to go a little higher on the older cells.
All right. I guess I'm also asking about this fee restriction to see if it's possible. I know that there's not been any real concrete proposal, but we're talking. You were talking earlier about the more trash we get, the higher our revenues, and if we have a reduction in trash, we're going to, we might be in trouble because our revenues are going to be reducing. But it sounds so very. It makes me wince because we're supposed to be on our big plan going to zero waste. And so I want to make sure that you are incorporating that in your plan and that EPA is in concurrence that, we're not going to get stuck paying tipping fees on increased tipping fees to cover this bond when we can get to a zero waste. You know what I'm saying? We want both of these things to be integrated. We want to get to zero waste. We want to slow down the filling of cell 3, and we want to keep fees reasonable. We already have a problem with illegal dumping, and I'm looking to see whether this bill is going to restrict some of the proposals we've heard. I don't know how feasible they are, where lifeline rates for, some customers, so that everybody is in the channel of funneling their waste through this program, not avoiding it because of higher fees or things like that.
A lot of the recycling that is occurring has been written into regulation through Guam EPA. That's set there. We have contracts, and some of these are ones that I don't like, but I've got to look long and hard before I change them. For an example, the receiver went into a contract for plastic bottle recycling, and the cost of plastic bottle recycling is $500 a ton. And their contract that we have right now that we've inherited from the receiver is a $500 a ton fee with a guaranteed minimum of $12,000 a month. So we are paying quite a bit of money right now on recycling. And we don't intend to cut that out right away. We may be able to renegotiate it as prices change. I don't intend to do away with recycling. It is something that is important. It makes people feel good. It does reduce the amount of natural resources that are used, but there does come a point where you've got to do a cost-benefit analysis along with environmental impact. And paying $500 a ton to get rid of a product is, I can landfill 2.5 tons for that price, and it's not cheap. And Guam it's opened my eyes here quite a bit since I came here, and things are extremely expensive here. And I could ship out of Jacksonville, Florida to India cheaper than I can from Guam to India.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, do you mind if we ask Walter Leongoro from EPA if he has anything to add to that?
No problem.
Good afternoon, Senators. Good question, Senator Talai. So this is the way I look at it. Right now, the tipping, first off, I want to confirm our goal at Guam EPA is to get to zero waste. Now, how achievable, attainable that goal is, it's going to be determined by world dynamics. Already, it's harder to get rid of recycling, but that does not deter us from continuing to get to zero waste. The way I see this hopefully occurring is right now Guam Solid Waste Authority collects solid waste majority and a portion of it being recyclable goods. And that's where their tipping fee is built on. I would like to foresee that in the future, Guam Solid Waste Authority now collecting recyclables and the solid waste being a smaller portion, and their tipping fee can pretty much stay the same structured, but I'm not the economic guru here. You have plenty of them here, but that's what I could foresee happening. Well, maybe not the tipping fee changes, but how the tipping fee is structured is what I would hope to see. That it's more collecting of recyclables. You know, most people have the 2 containers. It's already separated now. So let's start filling up the recyclables and get that taken care of and recycled. And the small trash that would be the solid waste is what would be going to the landfill. And that's what Guam and EPA's intent would be.
Thank you, Senator Chennai. Senator Kelly, do you have, you have a small one? Okay, Senator Kelly.
DDD. So in continuing in this strain of thought, I also, in hearing about some of the cost analysis associated with waste disposal, how having more of it can bring in more revenue, found that problematic. And I do understand that you see beyond that you have a bigger picture and it's not all just a cost analysis, because of course the impact to the environment and so forth is very important to us as well. Can you help me understand what the percentage is? And I understand that landscape is changing of what we can send off island. Can you help me understand what percentage of recyclable goods or other waste we're able to send off island at this particular time?
The metals, aluminum, tin cans, white goods, the washers, dryers, those items are all going now. We do have plastics going. The glass that we collect is actually being utilized on island in place of purchasing aggregate, in place of purchasing coral rock. Because when we build our roads at the landfill, you got to have something in that clay that will give a little more support, because when it rains, all the trucks would get stuck. So it's either mixed rock with the clay, or we've been taking the glass and crushing it up and mixing it with the clay to give us a substantial base for that. So it's technically it's a reuse more than a recycling. We have tires that are being shredded and sent in for, they're being sent off the island as tire-derived fuel. But like I said, this is all very expensive, and it is the funding that we receive through the tip fees that we're paying for these recycling services with.
So it's very good to hear that listing. It was more comprehensive than I had understood it at this point. Do you have an understanding of the percentage, though? So that was a very good and helpful listing, but do you have an understanding of percentage of?
I have not gotten into that yet, because some recycling is being done by the commercial entities at a commercial facility. We have, of course, at all of our transfer stations, drop off for citizens for recycling, and we have our household collection of recyclables. So it's a multi-faceted aspect that's not covered under one form. And when I got here, the receiver had been keeping all records for recycling as household waste collection. So I'm in the process now of trying to break all those costs and and tonnages and everything out into an individual setup where I can actually see what the true cost is for the recycling, how much is actually occurring, what it is per ton, and I can provide that. With that information, the more information you have, the easier it is to make decisions about the future of programs.
So it sounds like one of the benefits, in addition to potentially having some savings by ending the receivership, is we will have more authority over the way that we're thinking about and working with our waste. And I mean, I consider that a positive to get past considering it household waste collection, and then to truly understand what we're dealing with and how to best manage all of it. So with that, and I don't know, but I'm hoping Mel, with her financial mindset, can help me out here, but anyone who knows how to. And so I'm thinking with some of the discussion that we've had about the having less waste may mean less revenue, but I want us to also be thinking about how this is going to stave off or put off or lessen the need for a future sale. So I'm assuming that there's some way that this balances out, that there may be less revenue coming in, but that there's also a positive, and I don't know if you can quantify that now, but that there would be a positive, because that would be putting off, it would be lengthening the use life of a cell, and it would be lessening the need for a future larger cell coming immediately down the pike, if you will.
Your new construction would be postponed, but your fixed costs, your existing fixed costs are going to continue. You still got to do your quarterly groundwater monitoring. You got to do your quarterly stormwater monitoring. You've got to do your gas testing. You've got to do all of those things. Even if you don't put one drop of garbage into the cell, you still have those fixed costs that are going to be associated with the original construction of a landfill. And that's going to go on from the time you close it for another 30 years after it's closed. And that's the thing. Your landfill is an obligation that will be there. Ours will last 50. Probably, my guess is a little more than 50. So 80 years from now, when my grandkids are probably gone, they're still going to be paying for that cell.
And again, it's useful to hear that, and I think trying to look at this in the big picture, not to get away from the bond issue really, but that for every landfill that we're putting together, okay, this one is coming down the road and there's no change of behavior that's going to change our need for it in the near future, but looking farther down the road, understanding that for every landfill that we're putting into place, it's got that 30, 50, 80 years of closure and monitoring and fixed costs associated with it. So I just think it's important for us to keep that all in mind. This one's, it's on its track, but for thinking in the future beyond that, to remember how this is all figuring in and all the associated lengthy number of years of costs that will be associated with future ones.
In the future, which I think will be within the next 15 years or so, there's going to be developments within plasma arc gasification technology. There's going to be improvements within pyrolysis technology, which will take waste, run it through new scientific processes, and produce energy out of it. It's not your typical waste-to-energy plant, although those have been functioning in Florida for 35 years and have not had a bit of problem with them. We've got ones that are actually 35 years old, and we got one that's 1 year old. Florida has more waste-to-energy plants than any other state in the United States. but that is considered old technology. There are new technologies that are on the brink of coming out, and as that happens, that's something that has to be looked at, because that new technology is your giant leap forward from what's happening now with a landfill to only landfilling 10% of what you were. And it will reduce your cost of recycling, because a lot of the items that are recycled have great BTU value for generating electricity, and you've got to look into the future. And that's one of the things I've been trying to tell people and teach people. When I make a decision today, I'm not just making it for tomorrow or next year. I'm trying to look 30 years in the future as to what my decision is going to have an effect at that time, because that's how long landfills last. And you know, it's difficult trying to learn the new situations in a place that I haven't been. I mean, I was in one place for 35 years, so it's a little different learning how expensive Guam is, what the costs are, what the benefits are. I could tell you in Florida right now, if you were to start a waste energy plant, what your tip fee would have to be, and you know what your break-even cost, and you know what your general revenue was going to be from the sale of electricity. But here, I would have no idea. I would have to have quite a bit of help to work that.
Well, Sejus Masi, I like to look at things in a very holistic way and looking farther down the road. So I think it's helped me, some of what you've mentioned has helped me create that context a bit. I'm also interested in our green waste, but I'm not sure that that comes into calculations here. So unless you think it does, but I can hold off on that one if needed. Yeah.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I guess this question is for Geeta. We're considering borrowing $30 million for this landfill cell, and so I just wanted to know, maybe for Geeta or GSWA, is Geeta facilitating or expecting to facilitate any kind of additional funding projects for alternative waste disposal projects? So to be clear, I'm not talking about this $30 million bond, but just other funding projects in the near future.
There have been none presented to us as of this time by GSWA or any other party.
Okay, thank you. For GSWA, Mr. Gass, in round one, you mentioned that you've never had to, or GSWA has never had to borrow money to build a new cell. And so I was wondering if you could walk me through your plan for future funding that would also, or for funding future cells without future borrowing.
The way it has to work, and the way every proper landfill manager runs the situation, is for when your first ton of garbage goes into a cell, when you first open it, a certain percentage goes for new construction, a certain percentage goes for closure, a certain percentage goes for long-term care, and what you have left over is your operational expenses from your tip fee. And that's the way it's always worked. What has happened here on Guam is that none of the future expenses were looked at. The only thing they were covering was the operational expenses. They never put money away for closure. They never put money away for long-term care. They never put money away for future expansion. And that's what ended up costing so much money when the consent order was issued and the receivership was put in place. I intend to try to cut savings and make those reserves to where the future will have, they may have to borrow because it's going to take multiple years to get us where we need to be, but you won't have to borrow as much. And then the next time it'll be even less. And then everybody's going to be breaking even. And we won't have to borrow money to build new cells in the future.
Okay, thank you. In terms of our previous conversation with regard to the full faith and credit of the government of Guam, to be clear, is it accurate to say that we are pledging our full faith and credit as a government because on its own GSWA doesn't have the credit history to demonstrate that it can handle its own revenue bond at a comparable interest rate? So we're asking for 6% or lower. So is it accurate to say that we're pledging our full faith and credit because at this time GSWA doesn't have the credit history to demonstrate that it's good?
Yeah, correct. In general, remember a revenue bond is pledged on a specific stream of revenue. If that specific stream of revenue is going through a transition because a situation such as ending the receivership or transitioning out of receivership, that doesn't lend to a history of a stream of revenue. So because of the higher risk associated with it, a revenue bond could be more expensive of an undertaking, as well as taking longer.
Thank you, that's helpful. Also to Gita, you said earlier that Gita did a side-by-side comparison of a GEO bond and a revenue bond with GSWA only. So assuming that you could float a revenue bond, what would be the difference in cost compared to a GEO bond?
Well, it's really speculative at this point, Senator, because of there's not the comparable for some. It's comparing GSWA to the port, for example, or GWA are apples and oranges, where therein is a track record of performance and their indicators, their metrics. So it would be speculative to say at this point in time. And then let's say we said, well, if they were like this for 2 years, in 2 years, we don't know what the interest rate climate is going to be at that point in time. So.
Thanks, Mel. Mr. Gass, just a few questions about our current landfill, I guess, the property. So how many cells will the current landfill footprint permit?
11.
11, and we're going out for number 3, correct?
We're going after number 3 now.
Okay. At our current use rate, when will we exceed the available land?
It will probably be, my guess, of course, the long-term plan says 50 years, but I think it's going to be closer to 65 because the growth that the engineers had forecast is not quite what we're seeing. They originally estimated that 10% of the landfill space would be used up a year for cells 1 and 2, and from what I'm seeing from looking back, it's more like 9.1% a year. So, you know, doing an engineering estimate for a long-range plan, they're going to be a little more conservative and say, you know, you need to plan out like this. But I think it's going to last a little bit longer, you know, maybe up to 15 years longer than originally thought.
Okay, I also understand that it's difficult to try to determine that because we don't know what new technology might be available to us at that time, and so it's kind of speculative. But okay, so I have 50 to 65 years is your
Correct.
estimate. Okay, Sidus Masi. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. We will now go to, I know that some of the senators are raising your hands. I'm going to go down the order as we went the first round. And then for the senators that didn't participate in the first round, you'll be the first. And after we're done with everybody from the first round, it'll be Senator Terlai would be next. Okay, so, but it'll be now Senator Amanda. Do you have any questions? None? Okay, we're now at Senator Morton. Do you have any questions? Hopefully not plenty, but okay.
No, not plenty, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much. Mr. Gass, going back to the 100% participants of the household for pickup, if we can achieve that number, I think you were talking about the monies that you can get from that will help in the future projections. Is that correct, on your future plans?
That's correct. We're looking at if we can increase the people who participate in the program, we can improve the services without increasing rates. It covers expected expenditures, but basically because of the economy of scale. If we get more people, it costs us less to pick up the garbage per household, and then we can utilize that to cover the costs in other areas, pay the bonds off early, do whatever's necessary. And that's one of the big things that we're hoping to accomplish.
Okay, and I'm assuming with the increase in those people participating, this would also help in our recycling efforts too, and to pay for the cost of recycling. Is that correct?
Correct. And what it does is the more people that participate, it has brought more people into the recycling program, because we don't only provide the trash collection, we provide the recycling cart and pick that up with it in their fee. So you're basically increasing the recycling rate within Guam.
Thank you. And just for Mr. Leon Girl, if we're, our understanding now is that there's only half of the total of 19,000 residents participating. If we increase that to, let's say, the other half, another 8,000 residents participating, would that help our litter situation? And do you see that as helping increase our recycling efforts as well?
That's a good question, Senator. Internally, with our solid waste program, we've had discussions with our solid waste program manager that we will, now that Guam Solid Waste Authority has most of the operations under their oversight versus the receiver, we want to work closely with them to identify the areas, if it's area location, or the people that have participated and then remove themselves from the list, why? And ultimately what we'd like to do in coordination with the Guam Solid Waste Authority is address these people and the people that don't have pickup services and say, what are you doing with it? Some of them, just in general knowledge, again, speaking with the Guam Solid, our solid waste program manager, have indicated, well, they pay someone to pick it up. So that's an interesting concept, because if they're trying to do the right thing and maybe at a cheaper rate than what Guam Solid Waste Authority is doing, that does not legitimize what the people that they're paying, where it's going. So it's an ongoing investigation that we want to do. We definitely want to work with Guam Solid Waste Authority on this so that we can hopefully, as you stated, maybe make these people understand that pulling themselves out to save the tipping fee is not saving the island, and rather you're hurting us. It's saving your pocketbook, but you know what? What are you doing for the long term of our island of Guam? Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Jim. Senator Tidingley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and again, thank you so much for staying this late in the evening to answer our questions. So I believe Senator Therese Chalahi had asked a question to Gita with respect to finding out if there's, to check out bond covenant or bond counsel. But my question would be, with regards to the bond covenants I'm talking about, you know, on this bond. So my question is there any way to put in the language of the bond covenant to ensure that in the event that BPT were to be lowered, that it would not affect the bond covenant? So is there a way to put, in other words, I know, Lester, you're looking at me like, what? Okay. In other words, you create an agreement on selling of these bonds and what's, the rules and regulations of how these bonds are being sold, what it entails. Is there any way to put in the bond covenants that the payback would be coming from tipping fees, and that it should not have any effect in the event BPTs are gone from 5% to 4%? Now, it's a question that I know you probably can't answer because you're basically going to say that we have to get with bond counsel. And I've worked at GITA before, and I know it's a simple phone call. As soon as we leave here, you're on the phone with bond counsel and asking them. So I know that Senator Chalahi asked for that question, so I hope we can get that answer tomorrow morning. I know that the good chairman is going to want to break for today, but I'd like to have, is that?
Certainly. I think one of the things, one of the documents is, the preliminary offering statement that I've, and I was spending some time reviewing it after the question was posed by Senator Chalahi. And in the preliminary offering statement, one of the primary reasons why lowering the BPT is problematic from the perspective of the bonds is because when it comes to general obligation bonds, these are outside of revenue bonds, general obligation bonds, the full faith and credit of the government of Guam, the sources of repayment are two major revenue sources of the government of Guam. The first revenue source is, of course, BPT, and the second is, federal monies that come through to our island, right, income taxes. Yeah. And so what makes the BPT language difficult for a general obligation bond is what we're sharing with our bond holders when we're going out and we're selling these bonds to them is the source of repayment is based off of BPT. And then for us to go and adjust BPT upward, bondholders are not concerned, but adjusting downward is wherein the question lies, and the subsequent evaluation of the indenture and the covenants by bond counsel. So is it possible to go ahead and stick the language of calling it, saying this is based on the revenue bond, so can you just not think about that? It would still, the BPT language would still be problematic for other general obligation bonds that are outstanding. And as long as this is a general obligation, what the bondholders care about is the general creditworthiness of the government of Guam, which it indicates that if our two main sources of revenue are BPT and income tax, and one of them is at risk, then that then becomes, well, you sold me a lemon here because you didn't tell me that you can just go around and mess around with the BPT rate. Does that make sense?
No, I completely understand what you're trying to say, but you're selling some bonds, and there are agreements that you can make when selling these bonds. And since we're talking about all day today about the revenue, the tipping fees coming, to pay off this bond, then I'm just saying that in the bond covenants, can there put something in there more obligating toward that? But I'm sure if there is some type of language, you look for it, because it was asked of the good senator with regards to that. So I hope we can get that answer by tomorrow morning. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Clint, did you have a follow-up? If not, Senator Chalahi, Pito Chalahi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Before I share my thoughts, I just want to thank the panel for sharing this wonderful so many hours with all of us. I thank you very much. It was mentioned earlier that the more trash collection that is collected, right, the more money comes into the pockets, right, of the people that are servicing us. And let me just say that a week ago, somebody came up to me and asked me, Senator, can you introduce a bill to to have those minimum wage household go free on the tipping fee. And with the discussion that we're having, I kind of just move away from that because I don't think that's going to work. But there is, let me just say that there is a whole lot of residents and households out there that are not paying tipping fee, especially those that don't have power, don't have water, people that are staying on the outskirts of the villages. So I know there is a whole lot of residents out there that don't pay tipping fee. But do you think it's fair if we go in with a bill and mandate those residents that are not paying tipping fee, maybe even those that are not working at all? Is it fair to say that we introduce a bill to mandate those people to go ahead and pay the tipping fee, or maybe not pay the tipping fee, give them a trash can so we can collect more trash from them? Do you think that's fair? I would think so, right? Because the more trash that is collected, the more money you guys will make, right? So, just a point of view.
It's the more trash that's collected that is paid for. If trash is collected and there is no revenue associated with it, it's a major expense, because we try to balance everything, and our objective is to have it balanced to where we cover our long-term obligations, our future expenditures, and our operations, and not make money. If we're making money, then we're not doing something right. But if somebody comes into the system and doesn't pay the same price as everybody else is paying, then that increases everybody else's cost. Everybody else's cost has to go up for every free disposal that is given.
I just wanted to bring that up because you had mentioned that
Yes.
the more trash collected, the more money is made. But I figured that also I know that the money is made through the tipping fee. Another question that I wanted to bring up is, in the beginning, earlier, it was mentioned that, one of the previous speaker had mentioned, the $30 million. $30 million that is being borrowed from the bond market. And they mentioned, the previous speaker had mentioned, what are we going to do on the lapses of that 30 million? And I guess, what are you going to do on the lapses of that 30 million? But my question is, what are we going to do? Where are we going to borrow? I know the Gita might be able to answer this, but you answered already that that's not in the planning stage yet. What are we going to do if the $30 million is not enough to satisfy the whole operation of the landfill?
That's something that would have to go for financing. I do not have the cash reserves. If you look at the statements there, we're hoping that the receiver is going to have a lower price with his negotiations. That's what's expected. That's what the judge had instructed the receiver to do. So I'm hoping that it's going to come in less than the 30 million, and that will cover any contingencies that are there. I have some. I have about 10% of that. Not even 10%. I've got about 1% of that to provide that had been saved for future cell construction. That's basically my contingency that I have.
And the reason I asked that because it was mentioned again that Shell 1 and Shell 2 went up to about 70-some million. Shell 3 is going to cost like 30 million. So, coming out with that number And with the, I am not sure how, because you mentioned that the pyramid, as the pyramid goes higher, the diameter of the bottom part goes wider, right? Are we going to do away with the existing 1 and 2 and go to another area and do a landfill in another area? Or are we going to flatten that area out, the 1 and 2, and get the proposed landfill or dump site?
That's something that needs to be discussed, in my opinion, within the next 15 years as to, are you going to try to buy more land around the existing landfill and use that infrastructure instead of building new? Depends on what the price is, how much population has grown, if there's now a housing development or people living close to where you were going to expand. That's why you have to think so far out in the future. The county commissioners in Orange County basically laughed me out when I told them that we had 50 years of life left, but we needed to buy more land for future expansion, because in 50 years, you're not going to be able to buy that property. That's how far out people need to think in the landfill business. But like I said, the technology changes may extend that length of time tremendously. If the new technologies come to if they come to pass and they are able to commercially operate, you could easily turn that 50 years of life into 150 years of life.
And you can also easily break down the pyramid and do another landfill right on top of it.
There are some areas that do mine old landfills out for waste to energy type of operations. That was a proposal that was done in St. Lucie County, Florida. But unfortunately, there was never a financing agreement that the company was ever able to obtain. So the plan and process fell through lack of financing.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. My colleagues, we're going to take a 10-minute recess because the IT folks have to reset the cameras. All right?